Now picture this, it's the summer of 1978. You are sat in the back of a Skoda 110. Your parents are sat in the front seat. You are currently stuck in traffic on mountain roads of Croatia because you're going on holiday to Yugoslavia. And obviously because this is behind the Iron Curtain, you can actually travel into the West. Your parents are sat in the front seat listening to an audio cassette of the latest Czechoslovakian hits. Your dad is nervously checking his cooling temperatures of his Skoda 110, nervously hoping that the traffic in front of you moves so that he can get some cool air rushing into the rear engine Skoda. Does that ring any bells for you? Obviously, throughout my life, my parents and my grandparents have told me so many incredible stories from Czechoslovakia, from the 1960s, 70s and 80s, and what life really was back then. And so I really wanted to find out whether life was as amazing as all of them describe, or whether this was just nostalgia and looking back at life through rose-tinted goggles of youth and nostalgia. And so follow me on the second episode of Deep Dives, and today we're going to look at what life really was like in Czechoslovakia behind the Iron Curtain. Now look, to address the elephant in the room, obviously I was born after the collapse of the Soviet Union and therefore the Czechoslovakian Socialist Republic, and also I was born after the dissolution of Czechoslovakia, so I never really got to fully experience what life was like back then myself. But I could live and picture these memories of what my grandparents and my parents have been telling me from a very young age. I can almost picture it in my head as I'm saying it. Sunny warm summers with no worries about safety, kids playing outside unattended until the late hours in front of their commie blocks. Harsh cold winters with a lot of snow, riding a sleigh down the massive hills with no regards for stopping or safety at all. Now look, we're obviously going to look at 5 different aspects of life in Czechoslovakia back in the day in order for us to determine whether it really was looking back at life through rose-tinted goggles of nostalgia and youth, or whether times really were better back then. We're going to judge this basing off of these 5 aspects: music, domestic music obviously, films, domestic films and how great the film production was back then. We're going to look at quality of life, we're going to look at domestic produce and self-sustainability, and we're going to look at the very end of the freedom and really what the feelings of people were like and why maybe the system collapsed at the very end. Now music, man, I could talk about music from Czechoslovakia so much. I just love listening to all of these old bangers. Obviously, there are many genres to cover of music, but in this video we're going to look at a few of my favourites and why they were actually quite revolutionary at the time, and that it wasn't just a copycat of, you know, Western music as a lot of people will have you think. Now here we go, brothers and sisters. Elan is one of my favourites. It's basically like an alternative rock band from the 1980s, 1990s. They combine like a rock with a little bit of disco and some really cold classics as well, which featured in some films and just iconic music videos and iconic soundtracks and beats, and they had these melodies of like the synth 1980s. Obviously it's important to mention that they were mostly started the band in the 1980s and carried over to the 1990s. Look, another one is Voda čo ma drží nad vodou, which basically means water that's holding me above the water. For some reason, listening to their music just takes me back into the 1980s of Czechoslovakia, wearing denim and aviators and rebelling against the system in these illegal raves in the abandoned warehouses. I mean, you tell me in the comments, what does listening to the music from Czechoslovakia of 1970s and 80s, where does that take you? And what do you picture in your mind when you listen to it? There's also a song called Vymyslená, which literally stands for made up in English, and it's obviously about a girl who he made up, imaginary girl who he made up in his head, and how he wanted to go on trips with her and have arguments and make up afterwards, etc. He basically made up a relationship in his head, but such an incredible song. It's not even the words themselves, but it's the melody, and it all ties in perfectly. But let me know what you think of Elan in the comment section below. Now obviously, me being a fan of rock music, we've also had some other great artists like Olympic. For example, they had a good song called Jasná Správa, which basically stands for a clear message. The song is from 1982, which is basically about a lad who's lost walking around his empty apartment after breaking up from a long-term relationship, and he's basically just fucked. Long story short. But it's just, again, what an incredible song, and it does send a message because it's a very relatable song, and this is what I like about these songs at the time. Very relatable. There was none of this wet ass pussy or whatever rubbish you hear on the radio nowadays. It was simple and relatable music, like about dating and relationships and, you know, not having money or whatever, going on trips. And Airline have a song about a bouncer who's not letting them into the club, and they could speak to him in Russian or Hungarian or Slovakian, or they could bribe him, or they could threaten him, and he's still not going to let them into the club. And see how simple that is. Go and find me a song on the top 40, top 50 of whatever country you live in at the moment that has innocent songs such as this, like, do you know what I mean? Now, films. I love this section. There's so many incredible cult classics and so many incredible films which really perfectly depict of what life really was like for everyday working class young people. Now look, a couple of my recommendations. Pelishki, Cozy Dance in English, alright? It's a Christmas classic, which obviously most Slovakians and Czechs watch every Christmas, as far as I'm aware. I watch it with my family every Christmas and never get bored of the emotion it evokes in me. It's basically recording everyday life of couple, of families living in Prague in the 1960s, and obviously their actual daily problems and funny arguments and discussions and current political situations, relationship issues amongst young generation, and obviously the societal norms at the time. And I especially love the ending, which depicts obviously the Prague Spring and 1968, the 15th of March, I believe, when obviously the Soviets have turned up overnight in Czechoslovakia, obviously with the warplanes and the tanks, and almost gives me goosebumps watching that section. That's my favourite part of the film, you know, it's like the cherry on the cake at the very end of the film. And I actually really do recommend you watching it. I did my research last night. I didn't even know that this film came out in English as well, Cozy Dance, or with English voiceover, obviously, or English subtitles. So I encourage you to go check this film out. It's an incredible cult classic, and if you're a Slovakian or a Czech watching this video, let me know in the comment section below what you think about this film and whether you watch it with your family for Christmas. Perin Baba, okay? It's like the Feather Fairy or something like that. Filmed in the Slovakian Tatra Mountains, a very special and magical place for me and many Czechoslovakians, I believe, and I encourage you to visit this beautiful mountain range. These incredible films of this incredible producer, Juraj Jakubisko. This was like his most iconic film, and these clips of what the Tatra Mountains were like. And I wonder how they captured these clips. It must have been a helicopter or something, because obviously this was early 1980s behind the Iron Curtain. Now, VW Beetle. Yes, the car driven by the naughty cross Germans. It was actually stolen blueprints from Tatra 77. After the occupation of Czechoslovakia, which has been used to create the Beetle, obviously, and take all the credit for it. In fact, Czechoslovakian cars like Tatras and Skodas were incredibly revolutionary at the time. Tatra 77, which obviously, as I've just mentioned, the Beetle was based off of, with its long wheelbase, rear-wheel drive, and rear engine, which was actually a V8, believe it or not, so much more powerful and much more advanced than the Beetle at the time. Another one of my personal favourites when it comes to cars and engineering is the Porsche the Eastern Bloc, which is what they call the Skoda 110R. This was a groundbreaking car from the get-go, having the engine in the back, being rear-wheel drive, having a pretty good weight distribution, which obviously led to the car actually winning a hell of a lot of championships. They won the Group A, they won some good rally championships, some European touring car championships, really successful cars. And you know, I mustn't forget to mention some hell of a lot of other good iconic Skoda cars have won some rally championships or Group A Scout championships in the past. And if you want to see these cars in person, I really do encourage you to head over to Czech Republic and to Mladá Boleslav and go to the museum and go check out these iconic old, you know, rally cars and race cars. I mean, they even have Formula 2 cars from the 1960s there. Did you know they had a team in the 1960s? Or a Le Mans car from the 1950s, which actually featured on the Grand Tour episode of Going East. So, yeah, just a little fun fact for you. But Czechoslovakia managed to reach a trade surplus in the 1980s, obviously meaning that they were actually exporting more than they were importing into the country, which is incredible. And they had the lowest debt per capita out of all the Eastern European countries at the time, which, once again, as I said, very prosperous time. And if we weren't held back by the Soviet Union, maybe we could have skyrocketed and being in a different planet, basically. Now, we're moving on to one of the most important topics of this video, which is the quality of life. And what could an average Czechoslovakian afford or do with their money and their time at the time. And how does that compare to what it's like now? This is one thing that my parents always tell me about, how everyone was equal in opportunities at sports as kids, in schools obviously. Everyone got the equipment, everyone was sharing the equipment, everyone got the right opportunity to be able to enhance their skills and their passions. Just a little bit different now, and the money does play a lot more of a role, especially for example in ice hockey. So the Czechoslovakian ice hockey teams were unbeatable. Same as football, by the way, incredible teams, right? And even though Czech Republic and Slovakia still do really well in football and ice hockey, etc., still to this day, but at the time, we were really dominant and we were unbeatable, okay? And it wasn't just because the two countries were united, it was because the money didn't play such a role in basically young kids getting the opportunity to play for these teams and these clubs and these academies and having to shell out massive amounts for equipment nowadays. Because nowadays, if you want to be a professional, hockey player in Slovakia, Czech Republic, your parents have to have a good amount of money to be able to invest thousands and thousands into your training and equipment, etc. So it's almost like a thing that people say now, that only rich kids play ice hockey in the national teams, and that's the one thing that they get angry at when the teams don't do very well. I did some research last night. I'll put some statistics on the screen right now, and this absolutely blew my mind. In order to buy bread in socialist Czechoslovakia, you'd have to work 9 minutes of your time. Modern day Slovakia, 18 minutes. How about properties, you may ask? Well, whilst in Czechoslovakia, an apartment based off of 1 meter squared, you would have to work 5 days to be able to afford its accommodation. How much would you have to work now to be able to afford 1 square meters of accommodation? 40 days. Now this brings us on to a very interesting point which I thought about last night when I was making this video and looking at these statistics. And I think after the dissolution of Czechoslovakia and the privatization of most of these sectors, and allowing, for example, supermarkets and these corrupt corporations like Kaufland and Lidl and Tesco to have a free reign over produce, and putting local farmers and local businesses out of business basically due to the convenience of these massive shops and supermarkets, I think we've allowed them to basically decide and dictate whatever the cost of these things are. And you can see on the screen here with the statistics, I mean, all of the life's necessities such as living, food, etc. was cheaper and better back in the socialist times. And that was because obviously everything was state owned and it wasn't privatized. Nowadays, with a lot of these houses, a lot of these apartments, etc., being owned by massive corporations, being owned by foreign investors, they dictate the price, and they don't care about whether everyone has a roof above their head and how people are struggling. They couldn't give a shit about that. They care about filling their pockets up with money and how much money they can get out of you, basically. I mean, look, granted, if you look at these little statistics here, electronics and all of the luxuries of life have gotten cheaper now, but there's a reason for that. TVs have gotten cheaper, phones and other tech has got cheaper, but that's consumerism. In order to feed the consumerist capitalist machine, you need to consume, because otherwise you wouldn't be spending money and you wouldn't have a reason to make money. So it just feeds into the machine. Like, these statistics tell it so clearly and easily. It's absolutely unbelievable. Obviously, capitalist system nowadays wants people to get all of these mortgages and debts and, buy all of these cars, because that's how the system works, All of the money is based off of debt. I mean, if you look at America, for example, right now, what's the most valuable asset? Student loans. It's the whole economy is based off of debt right now rather than self-sustainability. This last part of this video is about freedom, and I think that's one of the shortcomings of the socialist times of Czechoslovakia and how life was back then. And maybe that's one of the reasons to why the system has dissolved, apart from the Soviet Union collapsing. Look, it wasn't all perfect back then, and we have to talk about the human desire of freedom and not being trapped by the system. Now, unfortunately, without people noticing, they have liberated themselves from one system and shackles of one system and fallen into the mass consumerist capitalist machine of modern day slavery. And look, this is a very interesting point. Even I've heard a lot of Czechoslovakia and the older generations experienced the socialist system back in the day, living in foreign countries like the UK, for example. And they're saying how much worse the censorship in this country is and how much worse the freedom of speech is in the UK now, for example, compared to what it was like in Czechoslovakia, And you would have a lot of people would have you believe that the censorship and freedom of speech, etc., was horrible back in the day, but was it really any different to what it's like now? What I'll say here is that the modern day capitalist world full of distractions, such as smartphones, latest tech, social medias, latest trends and shows on Netflix and so on. It really is easy to live in your little bubble of comfort and 9-to-5 wage slavery, not looking up, questioning the system and realising that what is happening behind the scenes. Who's profiting off of your loss, which is accumulating massively? And maybe the lack of these distractions brought a lot more of an exposure to the system back in the socialist times. And also, thinking about is maybe back in the day, especially, 10, 20 years after the war, people were just grateful for what they have. And they didn't want more and more and more and just keep accumulating more and more as people do nowadays because of what this consumerist system would have us believe. I think this was such an interesting video to be able to go back in time and look at some of these clips and some of this music and some of these films, and let me know in the comment section below whether you could reminisce or whether you could at least picture yourself living there at the time. And maybe if you could travel back in time, and if you could experience certain time period, if you would travel back to Czechoslovakia and what our parents and grandparents experienced, and if you could live through that, would you do it? If you enjoyed this video, like the video, subscribe to the channel because there's going to be so many more interesting deep dives on history as well, and more on Czechoslovakia as well. So I also have a football channel, by the way, so if you like footy, check this channel out on the screen wherever it's going to be. Have a lovely, lovely day, and I'll see you guys in the next one.